The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of our suburban home. I was upstairs, organizing my bookshelves, an activity that had become a habit whenever my mind needed grounding. My stepson, Liam, had just returned from his university break. He had always been a presence I cherished in my life, a part of my husband's world that I welcomed into mine when we married 7 years ago. Liam was in his early 20s, lean and tall, with an easygoing charm that drew people to him. Over the years, he'd grown closer to me in ways that felt familial and supportive. He was considerate, often helping around the house, something that made my husband proud. Today, he'd offered to cook dinner, a gesture that seemed to surprise even him. My husband, Greg, was at work, the way he often was these days. His job as a project manager kept him away for long hours, leaving me to fill the quiet spaces in our home. Our marriage wasn't bad. It just wasn't the way it had been. We'd fallen into routines that felt more like cohabitation than connection, but I thought of it as a phase, a natural ebb and flow. As the evening approached, Liam called out from the kitchen. "Emma, dinner's ready." I walked downstairs to find a neatly set table. He'd made pasta and a salad. "You didn't have to do all this," I said, genuinely touched. "I know," he replied with a smile, "but I figured you deserved a break." We ate and talked about his studies, his friends, and his plans for the summer. His stories filled the room with a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in a while. It was nice to have him around again. After dinner, Liam hesitated as I began to clear the table. "Emma, I've been practicing massages for a sports therapy class," he said, his tone casual. "If you ever need one, I could use the practice." I laughed. "Are you saying I look like I need a massage?" He chuckled. "No, just putting it out there." Something in his tone was warm, innocent even, and I thought nothing of it. "I'll take you up on that offer when I've had a rough day," I said lightly. The evening went on uneventfully. Yet, as I lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, a faint pull, an anticipation I couldn't quite name. The following week passed uneventfully, or at least so it seemed on the surface. Greg was busier than usual with an important project, often leaving before sunrise and returning well past dinner. Liam and I naturally settled into a rhythm. He'd help with chores, keep me company during meals, and share anecdotes about his college life that made the house feel less empty. It was a Thursday afternoon when Liam's offer resurfaced. I'd been rearranging furniture in the living room, an impulsive project spurred by a desire to feel more in control of my surroundings. By the time I was done, my back ached and my shoulders felt tight. Liam walked in, carrying a bottle of water. "You look like you've been wrestling with furniture," he said with a grin. I smiled tiredly. "It feels like I have." He leaned against the doorway, watching me. "Remember that massage offer? It's still good, you know." I hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate. Then again, Liam was family. This was just a kind gesture, and my body genuinely ached. "You know what? I'll take you up on that," I said, brushing off my reservations. Liam fetched a massage oil he'd mentioned keeping in his room for practice. He moved a dining chair into the center of the living room and motioned for me to sit. "Just relax," he said. I perched on the chair, feeling oddly self-conscious as he stood behind me. His hands, firm and steady, began working on my shoulders, kneading the tension out of my muscles with surprising skill. "This is amazing," I admitted, feeling the knots in my back loosen. "You've got some serious stress stored up," he replied, his tone professional. "Greg must be keeping you on your toes." I chuckled softly, avoiding the depth of that statement. Maybe it's just the furniture. As the massage continued, a strange energy filled the room. It wasn't overt or intrusive, just an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. Liam's touch never strayed from respectful, but his closeness was undeniable. When he was done, I stood and stretched, feeling an ease in my body I hadn't experienced in weeks. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "Any time," he replied, his voice casual, though his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than it should have. I shook off the unease, telling myself I was overthinking things. Liam was just being kind. I was probably imagining the flicker of something unspoken in the air between us. But that night, as I lay in bed once more, I couldn't help but replay the moment in my mind. The warmth of his hands, the faint smile on his face, and the way the air seemed heavier than it should have been. Something had shifted, though I couldn't yet name what. Over the next few days, Liam's presence became an unspoken comfort. He had a way of filling the silence in the house that I hadn't realized I needed. Whether it was his easy banter or his willingness to lend a hand, he seemed attuned to the spaces where I felt overlooked or taken for granted. Greg remained preoccupied with work, his late hours turning into overnight stays at the office. It wasn't unusual. His job had always demanded a lot. But this time, I felt the weight of his absence more acutely. One evening, after another dinner spent with just Liam, I found myself feeling restless. The massage he'd given me lingered in my thoughts, not just for the relief it brought, but for the strange undercurrent that had accompanied it. "You look like you've got something on your mind," Liam said as we cleared the dishes. I laughed lightly, brushing off the comment. "Just the usual. Nothing exciting." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Well, if you ever need another massage to clear your head, you know where to find me." His words hung in the air longer than they should have. I couldn't tell if he was teasing or genuinely offering. Something about the way he said it made me feel warm and flustered all at once. "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, keeping my tone breezy. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I stared longer than I intended, noticing details I hadn't paid attention to in years. The curve of my shoulders, the way my hair framed my face. I felt a pang of self-awareness, a strange sense of wanting to feel seen. I brushed it off and climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept circling back to Liam, his laugh, the way he filled the house with energy, and the way he seemed to notice me in ways Greg hadn't in years. The next morning, Greg was gone before I woke up. Liam and I crossed paths in the kitchen. He was dressed in a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, a mug of coffee in hand. "Morning," he said, his smile easy and familiar. "Good morning," I replied, reaching for my own cup. He hesitated, watching me as I stirred cream into my coffee. "Emma, you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" His words caught me off guard. "Of course," I said, trying to sound unaffected. "Why?" He shrugged. "I just get the sense that you're holding a lot in." I didn't know how to respond. He wasn't wrong. I had been feeling isolated, disconnected from Greg, and unsure of how to bridge the growing gap between us. But I wasn't sure it was something I could, or should, confide in Liam. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Really?" He nodded, but didn't look convinced. For the rest of the day, his words lingered. They nudged at something inside me, something I couldn't quite name but also couldn't ignore. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. Greg had mentioned he'd be working through the weekend, leaving the house once again to Liam and me. I spent most of the morning tidying up, but by mid-afternoon, I was nursing a dull ache in my lower back, a reminder of how much time I'd spent hunched over scrubbing and organizing. Liam noticed as I winced, reaching for a glass on the top shelf. "You're pushing yourself too hard again," he said with a teasing grin. "You should let me help." "I'm fine," I said, though the stiffness in my movements betrayed me. He tilted his head, studying me for a moment. "How about another massage? Just to help with the tension?" I hesitated, memories of the last one flashing in my mind. "I don't want to bother you," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "You're not bothering me," he said firmly. "Come on, it's no trouble." Before I could overthink it, I agreed. "All right, just for a few minutes." We moved to the living room, where he set up the chair again. I sat down, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Liam stood behind me, his hands settling on my shoulders with a familiarity that both comforted and unsettled me. As he began to knead the tension out of my back, I felt myself relax despite my swirling thoughts. His hands worked expertly, drawing out the knots and stiffness. "This really does help," I admitted, my voice soft. He chuckled. "Told you. You just have to trust me." There was something about the way he said it, the confidence in his tone, that made my breath hitch. The air in the room felt heavy again, like it had during the first massage. His hands moved lower, working along my shoulder blades and upper back, and the warmth of his touch seeped into me in a way that felt almost intimate. I told myself it was harmless, that I was imagining things. But then his hands lingered a moment too long. His thumbs brushed against my skin in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "Liam," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped immediately, stepping back as though realizing he'd overstepped. "Sorry," he said, his voice thick. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I interrupted, standing quickly and turning to face him. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The tension between us was undeniable now, a current that buzzed in the space between us. "I should probably get back to what I was doing," I said, my voice shaky. "Yeah," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "Me too." But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed. The following days were marked by a strange, unspoken tension. Liam and I avoided bringing up the moment in the living room, but it lingered in the air like a storm cloud threatening to break. I caught myself analyzing every glance, every casual touch that seemed to hold more weight than it should. Greg's absence didn't help. His long hours at work had become a constant in our lives, and with each passing day, it felt as though his presence in our home grew fainter. The space he left behind was filled with Liam's laughter, his stories, and the subtle awareness of what had passed between us. One afternoon, I decided to clear my head with a walk in the park. The crisp air and the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath my shoes offered some clarity, though not enough. When I returned home, I found Liam in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a book in hand. "Hey," he said, glancing up. His smile was warm, but there was something cautious about it now, as though he, too, was navigating unfamiliar territory. "Hey," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence felt louder than it should have, a reminder of the invisible line we'd crossed. "Look," Liam finally said, closing his book. "About the other day. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said quickly, though the words felt too automatic. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady. "I feel like I've made things weird between us." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You haven't. Really." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Something had shifted, and there was no pretending otherwise. I don't want things to be awkward," he said. "You're important to me, Emma. I don't want to mess that up." His words struck a chord in me, though I couldn't say why. I nodded, offering a small smile. "You're important to me too, Liam. Let's just forget about it, okay?" "Okay," he said, though the look in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. For the rest of the evening, we fell back into our usual rhythm, chatting over dinner and watching a movie in the living room. But beneath the surface, I could feel the undercurrent of something waiting to rise. When I went to bed that night, I found myself thinking about Liam's words, the way he'd looked at me, and the warmth of his hands during that moment we'd both tried to push aside. I told myself it was nothing, that we'd moved past it. But deep down, I knew the storm was still brewing. The weekend came, and with it, another stretch of hours where Greg's absence felt more like a presence itself. I woke up to find a note on the counter. "Big deadline Monday. We'll be at the office all weekend. Love you, G." I stared at it for a long moment before folding it and slipping it into a drawer. The words were routine, almost mechanical, and I realized with a pang that I couldn't remember the last time he'd left me a note that felt personal. Liam, on the other hand, was up early, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop. He was focused, the faint lines of concentration on his face giving him an intensity one rarely saw. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. He looked up and smiled. "Morning. How'd you sleep?" "Fine," I replied, though it wasn't true. My sleep had been restless, filled with fragmented dreams I couldn't quite recall but left me feeling unsettled. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. I hesitated, then nodded. "Just tired." He closed his laptop, his full attention on me now. "Do you want to get out of the house for a bit? It's a nice day." His offer caught me off guard. "I don't know." "Come on," he urged. "Fresh air might do us both some good." I found myself agreeing, if only to break the monotony. We ended up at a trail near the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't been in years. The winding path led through a forest thick with autumn leaves, their colors vibrant and alive. As we walked, we fell into an easy conversation about his plans for the future, his studies, and his dreams. It was the kind of conversation I hadn't had with Greg in a long time, the kind that reminded me what it felt like to connect with someone. At one point, we stopped at a clearing overlooking a small lake. The sunlight danced on the water's surface, and for a moment, the world felt still. "This place is beautiful," I said, taking in the view. "Yeah," Liam replied. Though his eyes weren't on the lake, they were on me. I felt his gaze and turned to meet it. The way he looked at me sent a shiver through me, a mixture of longing and hesitation that mirrored my own conflicted emotions. "Emma," he said softly, stepping closer. I should have stepped back. I should have said something to stop what I knew was about to happen. But I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot as he closed the distance between us, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, and when his lips met mine, it was like the world around us fell away. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it. The warmth of his kiss, the way his hands rested lightly on my arms as though he were afraid I might pull away. But then reality crashed over me like a wave, and I stepped back, breaking the connection. "We can't," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his expression a mixture of regret and yearning. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as though I could shield myself from the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "We should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam nodded, and we walked back to the car in silence. The drive home was quiet, the air between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. When we got back, I went straight to my room, closing the door behind me. I leaned against it, my heart pounding as I tried to process what had just happened. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed that. The kiss haunted me for days. Every time I saw Liam, I felt a mixture of guilt, shame, and something I couldn't name, a pull I couldn't quite resist. I avoided being alone with him, keeping our interactions brief and impersonal. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Liam, to his credit, didn't push. He acted as though nothing had happened, giving me the space I clearly needed. But there were moments when our eyes met across the room, and the memory of his touch, his kiss, would flash between us like a secret only we shared. Greg's absence continued to stretch, leaving the house feeling emptier than ever. It was during one of these evenings, after another solitary dinner, that I heard a knock on my bedroom door. "Emma?" Liam's voice was soft, hesitant. I opened the door to find him standing there, holding a glass of wine. "I thought you might want some company," he said. I hesitated, but the loneliness I'd been trying to ignore won out. "Okay," I said, stepping aside to let him in. We sat on the bed, the wine glasses between us. The conversation started light. Movies, music, the places he wanted to travel. It was easy, comforting even, until it wasn't. "I'm sorry about what happened," he said suddenly, his voice low. I looked down at my glass, unsure how to respond. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he continued, "but I can't stop thinking about it." I felt my breath catch, the weight of his words settling heavily on my chest. "Liam, we can't." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated, and I don't want to ruin things for you. But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel." I stared at him, the sincerity in his eyes breaking down the walls I'd been trying to build. "It's not just you," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. For a moment, the air between us was still, charged with the weight of what we'd just confessed. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, we moved closer. This time, there was no hesitation, no chance to second-guess ourselves. His lips met mine again, and all the reasons why we shouldn't faded into the background. His hands were on my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself fall into the moment, into him. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd done hit me like a tidal wave. "This has to stop," I said, my voice shaking. Liam nodded, though the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. He left the room quietly, and I was alone again, the taste of his kiss still lingering on my lips. I told myself it was the last time, that I wouldn't let it go any further. But deep down, I knew I was already past the point of no return. The days after our second kiss were a blur of conflicted emotions. I avoided Liam as best I could, retreating to my room or finding excuses to leave the house when I knew we'd be alone. But avoidance didn't erase the tension or the memory of how it felt to be close to him. Greg called that week, apologizing for his long hours and promising he'd make it up to me soon. I murmured reassurances, but his words felt hollow. The gap between us had grown too wide to be bridged with promises. One evening, as I was finishing up some laundry, I heard Liam in the living room. He was playing his guitar, a hobby he'd picked up in college. The melody was soft, almost melancholy, and it pulled me toward him like a thread I couldn't resist. I found him sitting on the couch, his head bent as his fingers danced over the strings. He looked up when he saw me and offered a small smile. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied, hesitating in the doorway. "Do you want to sit?" he asked, nodding to the seat beside him. I shouldn't have, but I did. The warmth of his presence was both comforting and dangerous, a combination I couldn't seem to pull away from. "You're really good," I said, gesturing to the guitar. "Thanks. It helps me think," he replied, setting it down. We fell into an easy conversation, one that felt far too natural given the circumstances. As the evening wore on, the distance between us on the couch seemed to shrink. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken pull between us growing stronger with every passing second. "Emma," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, he leaned in. This kiss was different, deeper, more urgent, as though we were both finally letting go of the pretense that we could ignore what was happening. When his hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, I didn't resist. I let myself fall into him, into the moment, shutting out the voice in my head screaming at me to stop. This time, we didn't pull away. The boundaries I'd been trying so hard to keep in place shattered completely. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises. Liam and I tried to keep things discreet, but the weight of what we were doing hung heavy in the air. Every glance, every brush of his hand against mine, carried the secret we were now both complicit in. Greg remained unaware, his long hours and frequent absences providing the cover we didn't deserve. I told myself I'd stop, that I'd end whatever this was with Liam before it went any further. But every time I tried to pull away, I found myself drawn back in. It was a Thursday evening when the world I thought I controlled began to unravel. Greg came home earlier than expected, his expression tired but hopeful as he walked through the door. "I decided to surprise you," he said with a small smile, setting his bag down. "I'm done with the project, so I'm all yours this weekend." I forced a smile, my heart racing. "That's great," I said, my voice too bright. Greg walked over and kissed me on the cheek, the gesture feeling both familiar and foreign at the same time. "I missed you," he said, and the guilt that had been simmering inside me threatened to consume me whole. He headed upstairs to change, and I stayed in the kitchen, trying to calm the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I needed to tell Liam that we had to stop, truly stop this time. It was the only way to salvage what little morality I had left. But fate had other plans. Later that night, as Greg settled into the living room to watch a game, I retreated to the bedroom. I told him I was tired, hoping to put distance between us, but the reprieve was short-lived. "Emma?" Greg called from downstairs, his voice sharp. I froze, my heart plummeting. "Yes?" I called back, forcing calm into my voice. "Can you come here for a second?" I made my way downstairs, my stomach churning with unease. Greg was standing by the TV, his phone in hand. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "What's going on?" I asked, though I already felt the answer tightening around my throat. He turned the phone toward me, and my blood ran cold. On the screen was a live feed from one of the home security cameras, the one in the living room, and on it was me and Liam. The footage wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. The closeness, the way we looked at each other, The way his hand lingered on my arm, it was damning enough. Greg's voice was low, trembling with controlled fury. How long has this been going on? I opened my mouth, but no words came. The weight of my betrayal hung in the silence between us, as heavy as the guilt I'd been trying to ignore. Emma, he said again, his voice louder this time. How long? I couldn't look at him. It wasn't what it looks like, I said weakly, the words hollow even to my own ears. He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. Don't insult me by lying, he said. I've been watching for weeks, Emma. Weeks. I wanted to be wrong. My knees buckled, and I sat down heavily on the couch, tears spilling down my face. Greg, I'm sorry, I whispered. I didn't mean for this to happen. But it did, he said, his voice breaking. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. Greg stood over me, his face a storm of anger and betrayal, his fists clenched at his sides, trembling, as though he was holding back an explosion. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, my tears falling freely as I stared at the floor. How could you? He said finally, his voice low but shaking with emotion. With him, Emma? My stepson? The weight of his words crushed me. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing I could say felt adequate. Nothing would ever justify what I'd done. It wasn't planned. I managed, my voice weak. It just happened. Greg's laugh was bitter, harsh. Things like this don't just happen, he snapped. You let it happen. Both of you. He turned away, pacing the room as though trying to find something to anchor himself. God, I trusted you, he said, his voice cracking. I trusted both of you. I wiped at my face, though the tears wouldn't stop. Greg, Don't, he interrupted, spinning to face me again. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I've watched the footage. I've seen enough to know exactly what's been going on. The room fell silent except for the sound of my quiet sobs. Greg leaned against the wall, his head bowed, his shoulders rising and falling with deep, ragged breaths. Finally, he spoke again, his tone cold and distant. Does Liam know I know? I shook my head. No, I whispered. Good, he said sharply, because I'll be dealing with him next. I felt a new wave of panic rise in my chest. Greg, please. Don't, he cut me off, his voice like ice. You don't get to plead with me. Not after this. He walked toward the door, grabbing his keys from the counter. Where are you going? I asked, my voice trembling. He stopped and turned back to me, his eyes filled with a fury I'd never seen before. To figure out how to pick up the pieces of my life that you just blew apart, he said. And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of our shattered home. Greg didn't come home that night. I stayed awake, sitting on the couch in the dark, replaying his words in my mind. The weight of what I'd done pressed down on me like a boulder, suffocating and unrelenting. Liam knocked on the doorframe of the living room sometime after midnight. Emma, he asked cautiously, what's going on? I heard the car leave. I turned to look at him, my face streaked with tears. His concerned expression only deepened my guilt, but I couldn't hold back the truth any longer. He knows Liam, I said, my voice hollow. The color drained from his face. What do you mean he knows? I mean he saw us, I whispered, my voice breaking. The cameras. He's known for weeks. Liam froze, his jaw tightening as he processed my words. Weeks? He repeated, almost to himself. Jesus. He's gone, I continued. I don't know where, but he said he was going to deal with you. Liam sat down heavily on the armrest of the couch, his hands running through his hair. This is bad, he muttered. This is really bad. What do we do? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his tone was resolute. We need to come clean. To him, to ourselves. Hiding isn't an option anymore. The thought of facing Greg again, of admitting everything, filled me with dread. But Liam was right. There was no undoing what had been done. The next morning, Greg returned. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with dark circles. He ignored me completely, heading straight for the kitchen and pouring himself a glass of water. "Greg," I said tentatively, stepping into the doorway. He didn't look at me, his voice flat. "Is he still here?" "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good," he said, setting the glass down with deliberate care. "Because I want to hear it from both of you." His words were like a knife to my chest, sharp and unrelenting. Greg sat at the dining table, motioning for me to call Liam. I obeyed, my hands shaking as I knocked on Liam's door. "Greg wants to talk," I said, my voice strained. Liam nodded, his expression tense but composed. Together, we walked into the dining room, where Greg sat waiting. His eyes bore into us, his silence heavier than any words he could have spoken. "Well," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Start talking." I glanced at Liam, who met Greg's gaze squarely. "It wasn't planned," Liam began, his voice steady. "It just happened, and it's on me as much as it is on her." Greg's laugh was bitter, laced with disbelief. "That's your explanation? It just happened?" "I'm not excusing it," Liam said quickly. "I'm just trying to own up to it." Greg's fists clenched on the table, his knuckles turning white. "You've destroyed this family," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Both of you." The words hit like a physical blow. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But you did," Greg spat. "You made choices. Both of you. And now I have to live with the consequences." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of his anger and betrayal pressing down on us like a suffocating fog. "I don't know what happens next," Greg said finally, his voice trembling. "But I know one thing. You've both lost any right to call this house a home." Greg's words hung in the air, heavy and final. The weight of his judgment silenced Liam and me, leaving no room for argument or appeal. "I want you both out," Greg said coldly, his voice steady now. "I don't care where you go, but neither of you belongs here anymore." I opened my mouth to protest, but Liam spoke first. "Greg," he said, his tone calm but firm, "you don't have to punish Emma like this. This is my fault as much as hers. If anyone should go, it's me." Greg's bitter laugh echoed in the room. "Do you think that makes you noble? A martyr, maybe?" He shook his head, glaring at Liam. "You've already done enough damage. Don't try to clean it up now." Liam fell silent, his jaw tightening as he absorbed Greg's anger. I took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to speak. "Greg, please," I said softly. "Can we at least talk about this? Figure out a way to fix it?" "Fix it?" Greg snapped, his eyes blazing. "How do you propose we fix this, Emma? Do you have a time machine I don't know about? Because short of erasing the last few months, there's nothing left to fix." I had no response. I could see the pain etched in his face, the betrayal cutting through him like a blade. Greg stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You have until the end of the week," he said, his voice clipped. "Both of you. After that, I don't want to see either of you again." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Liam and me sitting in stunned silence. When the front door slammed shut behind him, Liam let out a heavy sigh. "He's right," he said quietly. "We've destroyed everything." I buried my face in my hands, the weight of our actions crushing me. "What do we do now?" Liam leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "We leave," he said simply. "It's the least we can do." For the next few days, the house felt like a war zone, each room a reminder of what we'd lost. I packed my belongings in silence, the reality of my impending departure sinking in. Greg barely spoke to me, his presence a cold reminder of the trust I'd shattered. Liam kept his distance as well, his own guilt weighing heavily on him. There were no more stolen moments, no lingering touches, just the quiet acknowledgement that we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. By the end of the week, we were both gone. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, the silence of my new home a stark contrast to the life I'd once known. Liam disappeared back to campus, his absence leaving a hollow space I couldn't fill. And Greg? He remained in the house we'd once shared, now empty of the people who had turned it into a battlefield. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle. But the aftermath of what had happened lingered, like a scar that refused to fade. I stayed in my small apartment, trying to piece my life back together, though it often felt like sifting through ashes. I'd thought about reaching out to Greg, about apologizing again, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What could I possibly say that would change anything? I'd broken his trust in the most unforgivable way, and the consequences were mine to bear. Liam texted me occasionally, his messages brief and filled with regret. He'd gone back to campus, trying to move forward with his life, though I suspected he was just as lost as I was. "I'm sorry for everything," one of his texts read. "I hope you can find peace." I never responded. As for Greg, I heard through mutual friends that he was throwing himself into work, avoiding personal conversations, and shutting out anyone who tried to reach him. The man I'd once known, the man I'd loved, had retreated into himself, and I was the reason why. One evening, months after everything had fallen apart, I found myself driving past the house. The lights were on, and I could see Greg through the window, sitting at the dining table with a drink in hand. He looked older, tired, and alone. I wanted to stop, to go inside and tell him how sorry I was, to beg for forgiveness I didn't deserve. But I didn't. I knew my presence would only reopen wounds that were still raw. Instead, I drove away, leaving behind the home where everything had begun and ended. In the quiet of my apartment that night, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not just for what I'd lost, but for the people I'd hurt, for the choices I couldn't take back, and for the person I'd become. There was no going back, no fixing what had been broken. All I could do was try to move forward, one step at a time, and hope that someday the pain would dull, and the weight of my mistakes would become easier to carry. In the end, we were all left to rebuild ourselves, each of us bearing the consequences of a love that had gone horribly wrong.